Welcome to The Third Story. I'm Leo Sidran. And this is the sound that the audience made at the Union Theater in Madison, Wisconsin on June 18th, 2018, when Boz Scaggs took the stage.
Ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together from Plano, Texas, Boz Scaggs.
That summer, Boz put out his latest record, Out of the Blues, the third in a series of projects that mined the depths of roots music, the blues, classic R&B, Southern soul, the kind of music that lit the fire under him back at the beginning when he was just a boy in 1950s Plano, Texas. Back before he was the legend, before he was the icon, before he was the hit maker, before he found his voice. Back before he began his career, one that now spans 5 decades and millions of records sold, back before he gave us the lowdown, before his name and his music were etched in our collective consciousness, Boz was just a boy from a cattle town, wondering what was happening somewhere else on the planet. But that June, back in 2018, Boz was on tour like he has been most years lately, crisscrossing the country, doing a thick string of one-off gigs, living on the bus, getting into the rhythm of the road.
How we doing? Yeah, sounds good.
Boz has always been known to have great bands who can execute the variety of styles that he encompasses on a very high level. And he's known to be a precise band leader too, so his touring band was, as usual, a finely tuned machine. But this night in particular in Madison, this wasn't with his regular band, and it wasn't his regular repertoire either. In the midst of his tour, he parked the bus, the band, the entire parade, somewhere in Pennsylvania, I think, and flew to Madison for this quick sprint through memory lane. He had spent one very influential year in Madison in the early 60s, one that helped to spin his life in a particular direction. Boz went to Wisconsin from Texas, ostensibly to go to school in the early 60s, although he didn't go to class very much, which is why he didn't last very long. But while he was there, he came into contact with all kinds of people and ideas that were new to him. It opened a window into a kind of cosmopolitanism that before then he really could only dream about, and it set him on his path as a lifelong traveler, both in the literal and the more figurative senses of the word. But he also went to Madison because his high school friend and musical companion Steve Miller was there already, and the two of them still had some unfinished business. Boz and Steve put together a band. They played Texas blues, R&B, and rock and roll, sang in 3-part harmony. They gathered some local folks into the fray and played every fraternity, tavern, and VFW within 100 miles. This time in his life was short-lived. He left Madison after a year and headed down to Austin, Texas briefly before sending himself on a 3-year walkabout overseas. And while he was living in Europe, he started to write songs and play with bands. He even had a small hit record in Sweden at that time. When he got back to the States, he went to San Francisco, hooked back up briefly with Steve Miller and the boys from that band, before going it alone, setting himself on his path and launching himself on that iconic solo career. The rest, as they say, is history, and that's exactly what we're here to discuss today. On the night in question back in 2018, there was weather. A storm system over the Midwest kept Boz from catching his original flight, and by the time he landed in Madison, he was taken straight to the stage for sound check. All of a sudden, the band looked up, and there was Boz, plugging in his amp and getting ready to run the tunes down. I don't think he ever saw the backstage. After the show was over, old-timers from the Madison scene in the 60s came to the stage door looking for him. "He'll remember me. Tell him my name. He'll want to see me. Please, can I come backstage?" But it didn't matter, because Boz was already gone. He had been ushered out again just as quickly and quietly as he arrived. He was like a ghost, like he was never there. He was put in a cab and sent to his hotel for a short night of sleep and a flight back to his traveling circus at the crack of dawn. How do I know this? Because I was the one who put him in the cab. Incidentally, I was also the drummer that night, and at some point that evening, walking him from the stage to the cab, we talked about setting up this interview. It would take nearly 3 years for that to finally happen. But, these interviews are really meant to be a window into someone's life, their process, their experience, their work. To the extent that I have any personal connection or private insight into a guest, I generally try to keep it separate from the conversations. But in the case of Boz, I do feel it's important to give some context for this because while I don't know him well, I am intimately familiar with one part of his story. That's the part that brought him back to Madison that night. See, when Boz got to Wisconsin in the 60s to reconnect with his pal Steve and start that group, they gathered a collection of locals into the band, kids from the college, whatever, And my dad was one of them. He played keyboard. Throughout the 60s and 70s, Boz and my dad came in and out of one another's lives, making music together, hanging out in Madison, London, LA, San Francisco. It was an incredibly fertile time for the music, culture, politics, and they were on the vanguard. I don't need to tell you this. You know this. So Boz came back to Madison on that night to play a one-off show with his old friend, and I was in the band. I think Boz has always been kind to me in our short interactions, in part because he's simply a gentle, calm character, and in part because he relates to me as the son of a fellow traveler in his life. His own son, Austin, is a music journalist and a musician who was also raised with a deep awareness of the 60s generation and the influence of that time and those people on the popular culture that followed, both on a personal and a general level. And I've had the pleasure of talking to a few other members of that cohort as well. I talked, for example, with Glyn Johns a little over a year ago. Glyn produced the first Steve Miller Band records on which Boz was a member and went on to produce two of Boz's early solo records. A series of conversations with my dad throughout the course of the podcast have also illuminated that period, and my talk with Boz's sometimes partner in crime, Donald Fagen, was revealing to say the least. You can hear all those and hundreds more at... Amanda, what's the website link?
third-story-story.com.
She got it. It's third-story.com. Sign up, subscribe, say hello, get involved, click the socials, or put some skin in the game, cards on the table, money where your mouth is by visiting patreon.com/thirdstorypodcast to support the project. We talked last week about how he's feeling right now, what he's thinking about, and his reflections on a lifetime of searching, traveling, and making music. Here's me and Boz Scaggs talking it down. Hey, Boz.
Hey, man. How you doing?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing okay. In turns, horrified, restless. It's an interview, so here we go.
I realized I reached out to you. I mean, I've been reaching out to you on and off for a few years, but the first overture I made in this last round was right when COVID started, and I was really thinking about you because it was like the universe was conspiring to get all these musicians off the road, and you were certainly not immune. You know, you had been a road dog for those last few years.
That's right, yeah.
So what was it like to quiet down?
Well, I think we went through a time of, wow, this is going to be the time to do those things that we didn't think we had time to do otherwise, to do some writing or catch up on things that we kept getting kicked down the road or put off one way or another. I didn't realize how much I was going to miss it. I mean, what a hole there was going to be in my existence and my purpose, my job, my fun, my work, all of that stuff was just, it took a while for that to sink in, that it's just not there. And of course, the routine of my life when I'm on the road is something that I really, I miss it now. And I miss it when I'm not there. It's usually after I get off the road, I have 3 weeks off or 4 weeks off. And after a couple of weeks, I'm really eager to get out there again. And the time passed years ago when I used to be out there for 2 or 3 weeks and start really thinking this is about enough, and start counting the days. And that just fell away after some time and some years. And it just became sort of like after I've been out there for a week or 10 days, I'm back in the groove and my voice is solid and my chops are solid and the band is starting to cook. And so I just fall into this rhythm. But yeah, I was glad to have the time off. It was a good rest. And that turned into the longest time off I've had since I was 17 years old or something. And a lot of changes. Of course, I'm concerned about my band, my crew, my people, and the rest of people in my city and everywhere. And there's no real peace to be had in this thing. But, you go through changes and moments of clarity and moments of doubt, and moments of frustration, all that stuff.
Do you think when the veil is lifted from this pandemic year, I mean, do you think you will want to resume that same intensity of touring and that same schedule that you had before?
I think about it now, Leo, and I'm not so sure. I am old enough to have done this a while. Something that came to me a couple of years ago was during an extended time off. I don't know, extended time off may have been 6 weeks, or may have been a couple of months. But I settled into my home, and my home has always been a place. We live up in the hills outside of San Francisco, or we did at the time. It became after weeks and weeks of touring, and after a number of tours, the end of the touring run, my home really became my sanctuary. I didn't really want to go into town, and I just wanted to be still and enjoy the peace of it and rest and really relax. And at a point, I remember a day, just particularly lovely day of just being still, and I started to write something, and I started to just think about my age and think about this time of life, and noting how different some things are to me now, the way I consider things. Some things there's certain considerations that I don't have anymore, certain worries I don't have anymore, certain ease of just life in general that I sort of embraced for the first time in my life. And it made me think, this is an important time. Actually, I was reading, it was about the time that Leonard Cohen was dying, and there was a lot written about him, and there were a lot of interviews and some brilliant pieces, brilliant things written about the brilliant man. And one of the things that he talked about was when he was in his early 80s, and right before he passed away, was how valuable that time was to him to put things in order, to let things settle, let his whole life settle. And that sort of rang very true to me, very, very poignantly to me, that this is a valuable time, and there's a lot of good in life that goes on at this point in life. And I think it's kind of, if you can find that and enjoy it, it's really a good time to do that. So I've just carried that with me the last number of years, and I feel this is a valuable time. And so COVID sort of blows up everything, whatever our inclinations are. I think they're certainly allowed to come to the fore during this time. Everything is heightened and intense in its own way. And the big questions are being asked of all of us, and existence is really the issue, and the things it takes to carry on. Or maybe that's I won't say the good side, but it's the side that might have some value to all of our lives throughout all this.
Yeah, it's hard to allow yourself to say that there's a good side, but I know exactly what you mean. We all kind of have had to spend this time with ourselves and confront whatever it is that we were doing. And man, I remember the last time I saw you, you were in the middle of a tour. You took a night off of your tour to fly to Madison and do the one-off concert with my dad.
Yeah, right.
And I just couldn't believe the pace that you were keeping and the intensity of it. I know that was a little bit of an outlier for you, but I mean, I was really impressed and kind of surprised that you handled it with grace and you played great and it was totally professional and great. But I mean, you're not a young man, and that's a very physically taxing thing to do to yourself.
Yeah, well, that was good, Leo. That was really a good time. That's part of what I miss. You have to be pretty vital doing 5 cities a week. You've got to have your something together. There's your routine and you probably saw, I just run. It runs like clockwork with me, and every day is the same in that way, but not the same at all. You have a new set of circumstances. There's a challenge every day, and at the bottom of it all, there's showtime. There's the downbeat, and that's the common denominator. That's where the real meat of the matter is. All roads and all activity has to lead to that moment when you're on, and we'll go through a lot to have it right, because there are sometimes when it's not right and it doesn't feel good, and then it doesn't make sense to not really have yourself prepared and together for that moment that we've given ourselves to.
I was thinking about, of all of the different iterations of your musical life, one thing that stands out is that you always find great bands and great units of musicians at the right time to work with. You clearly like working with great players and, riding that wave.
That's right. There was a time when, there was that stage of my career or my life that, led me to have my own band and start my own career in San Francisco. That was a time that I could, when you're, it's like, who's the bass player? Who's the drummer? Who's over a period of a few years, you really get down to the people who you can really find that balance with, find that spark, and that joy, and that it pushes you forward. And, when you're in a band situation, there's a fine balance to keep, and it takes a lot of tending, like a family or like any relationship. It takes a lot of tending. And you find what it is you need and how what the different aspects of your own, your own way of doing it are. And I passed out of that phase into, there was a time when I just had to get something done, and the way forward was to go into a studio with studio musicians. And that happened to me on a record that I made in LA called Slow Dancer. And I was put in to the room with a staff producer from my record company, CBS, who came out of the rhythm and blues world, who put me in touch with a lot of musicians who were moving out of Detroit, out of the Motown scene, were moving to LA at that time, and I got hooked up with a bunch of those amazing players, and that energy was just a real blast for me, and getting the idea that those guys know how to turn your ideas, your little song ideas, or there's any number of ways to take it, but when you put it in the hands of those guys, they turn it. It's alchemy, the way they can take your idea and turn it into this cohesive, bright, proficient energy. And anyway, I was kind of hooked from that time on. And after having sort of got my feet wet and realizing what was possible, I went into the next record I made, which I already assumed would be in LA, would be with studio players. As I was developing the material, I was thinking about, I was learning who was in the field and who might be able to really take me where I wanted to go with it. And anyway, one thing led to another, and I developed a great appreciation for that cast of characters and what was possible in that realm. So ever since I opened that box, it's sort of led me every step of the way I've gone since then. Since a lot of that material was developed by high-level players, it takes extremely versatile and high-level players to perform it, to recreate it, as I do on the road. So that just set me up for, if I'm going to do it, there's a body of material that requires a certain level of musicianship and a certain style that actually quite a number of different styles that I've recorded in, and it takes some remarkable players to sort of play into all those areas. So yeah, I need them. I need these folks.
Well, that cast of characters that you describe working with, particularly in that period between Slow Dancer and the following record, Silk Degrees, that's a pretty famous collection of cats. Those players that you assembled not only made history by recording on Silk Degrees, which was a huge hit record, but also they went on to form the group Toto, and that's a story that has been told for years. It's interesting that you describe, from within the context of having been in a band where you were confronted with a certain amount of compromise and a kind of group dynamic of not having the autonomy to do things the way maybe you would do them if left to your own devices. When you finally got your hands on that control, on that creative freedom, on that autonomy, you enjoyed giving some control up, giving quite a bit of control up, as you describe it, and letting them run with it. It's a balance between control and chaos, and finding that sweet spot.
Yeah, exactly. I think that in my case, everybody handles it differently. Some people have a very clear idea of what they want out of those players. I'm the other end of that spectrum. I feel that the music depends very much on the chemistry in the room, and I choose the players very carefully. But that's almost when you throw it up in the air. By when you get in the room, I am very passive in my own way. It gets headed my way, one time or another. I mean, there are run-throughs and there are arrangements, suggestions, and there are, ways that I begin to hear the germ of the song in my own head that I can impart as I go and all that. But I very much respect and expect and let the guys have their reign in the studio. And I think that's where some magic can happen.
Do you feel like you were a natural performer? You seemed really compelled to play the music, but were you compelled to be out in front to be the performer?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so at all. I see people who are at home on stage and completely collected and can really work with their audience to create an event. I don't have that. I have not a natural affinity to being in front of people. I don't find it easy to speak on stage. I'm not candid. I am comfortable because I know my material. I know my musicians. I know the technical aspects of what I'm doing. I know what needs to happen with sound mixing and lighting and so on and so forth. But no, it's not a place that I belong.
It's such an interesting thing to have devoted your life to something that at the heart of it contains a kind of unease or a piece of it that is sort of like not a natural fit.
Well, it's not it's the most comfortable thing in the world, though, you see, and that's why I do it. It's the most wonderful sensation that there is. You're a musician, and I'm sure you relate when I say, it's magic what we do. Mm-hmm. It's magic that we feel. It's magic just to sit alone in a room with an instrument or your voice and let those vibrations, not to sound too hippie about it, but let it happen to you. Let it wash over you. It's one of the greatest joys in life. Mm-hmm. And we are chosen. We touch that. We get a hold of that live wire, and we are addicted to it for the rest of our lives. It's life blood. So, yeah, to be able to keep that energy and to stay in that realm, to stay in that state is what we're all about. Mm-hmm. If you want to think of it, in terms of, I don't want to use the word addiction lightly, and it's not like that, like a harmful addiction. I don't think anyway, but it is something that we have to return to and a fix that we've got to have.
Yes.
So there we go. We get it where we can, and then there's that magic moment that almost everyone has in their lives when you get to go play your music and you get paid for it, and you kind of go, what? And it sets off a whole other course in life. And so, yeah, it's a strange thing that on the one hand you feel so uncomfortable, but when you're in the moment with it, it's the greatest joy. I mean, I've got the best seat in the house. Playing with the musicians I play with and being the object of the audiences that come out.
You talk about how we're called to it, and of course I relate to that. I understand what you mean.
I know you do.
Do you remember when you realized that it was what you wanted to do, and do you remember that first time that you got paid to do it?
I remember absolutely the first time I got paid to do it. I was sitting in for someone who couldn't play in a combo in high school, and I was asked to play a New Year's Eve gig. I was a guitar player, but I played a little bass, and I was asked to sit in for the bass player at a New Year's party at a Holiday Inn or something in Dallas, where I lived. And I think I got $12. I don't remember the amount, but it was $25 maybe. It was unforgettable. It was a thrill to get asked to play and to jump in and all that. That was the real thrill. But then to get paid for it, unforgettable. But there was another part of your question that interested me as well.
Which was more just, do you remember realizing that it's what you wanted to do?
That's an interesting question to me because I didn't really think of myself as a professional musician until I'd made a couple of albums. Mm-hmm. I always thought of myself as a traveler, somebody who was just sort of a seeker or a searcher for something. And I traveled around the world. Being able to sing and play guitar was my ticket.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I did. That's how I got from place to place, and that's how I saw myself. And it was only after I had traveled a lot, I lived out of America for about 3 years. I came back into San Francisco in 1967 on a job offer to play, and I stayed with that band for maybe 9 or 10 months, but it was enough to get my feet on the ground in San Francisco in the club circuit. And that led to my getting a recording contract with Atlantic Records, making my first album. And then I just went about my travels again. And it was only when I had a girlfriend at the time in San Francisco, and we decided to move in together. It was the first time I actually had a rent to pay. I mean, I'd had to rent apartments in various times in various places, but this was like a move. This was like an official move. And I had to be responsible for a place that was going to be there for over 2 months or something, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And it was at that point when I realized I have to get a band together and I have to like make a steady thing of this. And that steady thing led to a second recording contract and a regular life. And that's when the light bulb went on that I'm a professional musician. Now I've got this responsibilities of keeping up a band, writing material, doing the whole thing. So I was late in the game before I really came to that. And it was a gradual thing, but it did sort of one day occur to me that, wow, this is it.
Did that change your relationship with what you had to do? I mean, having to write a song knowing that that's your livelihood, that's what pays the rent and keeps your band working, it takes on a different kind of weight, pressure, knowing that that's your gig, not just what you do because you like it.
Well, you got to pay to play, and you know at that point you're living pretty much hand to mouth. You're working as many nights as many gigs as you can get. You're on the phone. You're calling the places you've worked at. They're calling you back. I didn't have management. I was doing everything myself, and again, the joy of playing was leading me on, and now it's the responsibility of keeping new tires, getting some new tires for the van, and getting the keyboard player's girlfriend's teeth fixed, and making travel arrangements, and talking to the booking agent, and I like that stuff.
Yeah,
I thrived on it. I worked 7 days a week for 10 years, and did a lot of different things, wore a lot of different hats to do that. I never thought twice about the work. I woke up every day with a list as long as my own for people to call and things to do. And I thrived on it. And the music pushed me on. And of course, when you're going gig to gig, you've got to keep your audiences have to be, that's where the rubber hits the road, that you've got to put the butts in the seats. And the audience you have to let them grow. You have to grow with them. So, it's just a good organic exchange all the way around.
Hey, I want to circle back to something that you described when you went traveling in the mid-'60s for 3 years and lived abroad. If you came back in 67, that means that you left in let's say 64, 65. Mm-hmm. Those were the years of crazy change, just unbelievable culture and social change in the United States. And then you land in San Francisco in 67. I mean, did it seem like the world had really changed back home? Did you find a different country and different culture than the one you left?
Different, yes. But that same shockwave went on around the world. And it was in many ways more powerful in Europe among my peers there than it was in America. It took a different form in America. In Europe, there was that awakening, or that few years of awakening and enlightenment. So let's take it from that angle. Mm-hmm. Was happening, but it had a different sort of body to it. It had a different context to it. I was living in Northern Europe. I was living in London, Copenhagen, Stockholm, and I was traveling. So there were more sort of tendrils of that that happening that had to do with art or literature or of in painting and film. There was more of a cultural spread, and that an enlightenment took place in those areas as well as, in the music. It just took a different form in Europe. So when I came back to America, I was in Bombay reading Time magazine. And I saw, the American kids dressed up like cowboys and Indians and having their jamboree and their time in the parks. And I had a friend actually. I had returned from India in that spring of '67, and I returned to Stockholm in that summer of the spring of '67, and I befriended a guy who was. His brother was in the Jefferson airplane, and he was back and forth between San Francisco and Stockholm, and bringing back records and magazines and news of what was going on in San Francisco. So I was, the whole world was aware because of the American media of what the American reaction to it all was. But the movement was going on in Europe, but it just took a different form. When I came back to San Francisco in September of 1967, I saw it in full bloom and was playing music and hanging out and was completely immersed in that American part of the culture. But it seemed somehow, it had a particularly American kind of expression. And it seemed, frankly, silly, superfluous, in a way, compared to the weight of it. Now, I came to also see that there were a lot of serious people in California and in America at that time. And beneath all the fun and games, there was a strata of deep seriousness. And of course, the war was cooking up, and there was a lot to be serious about. And it was about that time, I think, in '67, when that whole culture began to take on a certain, the fun was wearing off, and a certain reality was moving in. It was different, but not different it was novel coming back to America at that time, and particularly landing right in the middle of the San Francisco culture.
Sometimes people talk about when they leave, they go away from home, they see themselves relative to their home, or they discover something about their culture that they wouldn't have seen from inside of it. And particularly, I'm thinking musically for you, when you went away, did it put you more deeply in touch with the blues or with the music that you had loved originally, or did it change your relationship with American music?
It made me realize that I was, somewhat unique to the Europeans in some ways. Now, the British were so much more steeped in the blues and rhythm and blues when I came in early 1965. And I came to London at a time to see, some of the formative British bands, in the clubs. And I was coming out of, Texas. I was living in Austin, Texas before I went to London. And that's a culture that's steeped in blues and rhythm and blues. And I was playing it in clubs, and I was among a group of young guys who were steeped in that stuff, but it was nothing compared to the way it was happening in London. I was hearing Bobby Blue Bland songs and T-Bone Walker and Howlin' Wolf every night in the clubs in London. I don't mean the actual performance, but I'm hearing their music and being performed by young Brits in the most profoundly accomplished ways. And outside of London, however, when I was playing in Scandinavia and playing in small clubs in Paris and in Barcelona and places I was traveling, I was just playing blues, and that was distinct to me. That was my style, and that's something that I could call on. And American roots music was something that was recognized and appreciated all over the world, all over the places I was. But at the same time, I was introduced to other kinds of music and playing other things. I was asked just to be a guitar player and more of a free form player there were more experimental aspects to what I was being led to do. So it was a mixed bag for me as a musician. I realized, and I was drawn to come back to America because I missed very much playing with other musicians who were steeped in that. In that time, that kind of music. I missed the blues and rhythm and blues, and I knew where I could find it. And of course, I was surrounded by it when I came back to America.
When did you start writing songs?
Well, I sort of composed the first songs, I guess, when I was in Europe in '65. Just little borrowed bits and pieces that added up to something that I could, sort of call my own.
And what about your singing style? Do you remember ever kind of like developing or cultivating your style of singing? Was it just how it came out?
Yeah, I think it's just how it comes out. You know, I'm a singer. I'm drawn to singers, and I'm a guitar player. I mean, drawn to guitar players, but I think I'm probably more proficient as a singer. And so, you're actually trying to emulate, all those singers that you really, really liked a lot. You're trying to do those licks in your head, and you're trying to get a cohesive sound out of the things that came before you. Radio was it when you're growing up as a kid, so that's where it all comes from. And so you hear all these different stylists, and you pick a little from here and there.
Not everybody has the good fortune of being a good singer and also being a stylist. There are plenty of great singers who are harder to identify. But, you kind of have both, that you're an accomplished singer and you also are a stylist who can be identified immediately when you sing.
I'm certainly not a natural born or a gifted singer. There are those who have a fully formed style from a younger age. They practically come onto the scene fully formed. There are others who develop a style over a period of time. I would certainly put myself in that last group. And as far as being a singer goes, it doesn't come easy at all for me. I have a hard time with intonation. I have a hard time with finding my, tonal structure. I work really hard at it. I'm very self-critical about it. And I'm proud at this point of what I can do. It took a long, long time for me to come to the point that I could say that. It doesn't come easily for me.
You described a little while ago waking up with a long list of stuff to do the length of your arm every day for 10 years and pounding the pavement 7 days a week. And, just kind of doing some loose math, 10 years of that would kind of lead you more or less to your big hit record. When Silk Degrees came out, you were a decade into doing this all the time, full time.
Well, I started that clock at about 1969 So I hit Silk Degrees in about 76.
Right. So not quite a decade.
Not a decade, but the 10 years I'm talking about lasted through Silk Degrees and another couple of records.
I see.
And ended up in 1980. So there's 10 or 11 years in there where I just didn't stop. It was all work. And in 1980, I sort of retired.
Yeah, I want to get there. But what I was heading towards was, I guess, the question of you had been successful. You'd been selling records, certainly enough records to convince the label to let you make another one. But then when you have a hit, was that something that you were aiming for? Were you hoping to have a record like that?
Oh, hell yes. That's, you think about having that record, man, having that radio hit. That's, that's big.
Yeah.
From the beginning, that's the big ticket, and everybody has that. I say everybody, I'm not going to speak for everybody, but that's part of the thing. That's the golden ring.
So what did it feel like when you got it?
It was about time. That sounds immodest, but I had it in my mind, and I know that a lot of people that I knew had it in mind when they were making their first recordings, when they were, first starting to get that together, that there's a period, that time in the recording process where you get in it and you're in the middle of it and you're writing and you're coming into the studio and the thing's taking shape and you're starting to hear the playback and it's starting to form a picture in your mind, and you really fall in love with what you're doing. You're just in you're in a groove, and things are sounding not right yet, but then you keep fiddling with them, and they start to take shape, and the edges start to smooth out, and the highs start to really shine, and you're starting to really see the vision come true. And toward the end of that, when you're in the final stages of mixing and finalizing, you're in love with this thing. And you're thinking, man, I can't wait for this thing to hit the street till the radio gets a hold of this one or something. And, and then it comes out, and then it's like, hey, don't you guys get it? It's like, hey, but you go out and you play it and you live with it, and it all becomes part of this beautiful meal. This beautiful thing that you dreamt up and shopped for and cooked up and served and so on and so forth. And then it's time to do another one. And if you're lucky, and that feeling stays with me, it stayed, record after record. And as you say, you're lucky. The record company gives you another shot, and you sign a contract, and you move on, and then you sign another contract, and you becomes at a point, when that feeling starts sneaking in on you in the project, and you go, this is it. You wise up, and you just go back to work and finish it and enjoy it and do the best you can with it and go out and play it. So when the big ticket came up for me with Silk Degrees, it was a slow ride. It started out like a number of records had before that. You put the first single out, and radio takes a little nibble, and you get a little bite, and you start getting some play, and the record sales start to come in, and so on and so forth. Well, Silk Degrees was very much like that. The first single came out, and it sort of, had a little run around the edges of the charts and radio, and then another single came out, and same thing, and then they're kind of, well, let's take another shot. Let's take one more shot at this thing. And the record company says, well, what do you want to do? And the management says, well, let's do this one. And people you talk to, the guys in the band say, well, what do you think of that one? So we put the third song on, I think it was Lowdown. And Lowdown sort of went out there with it, same as the other two, and floated around for a while until it crossed over into black radio. And I think it was Cleveland. I'm sure it was Cleveland. And it moved into the R&B, the soul charts, and started getting airplay on the street. And that led to more airplay. And it was a slow but hot build. And I couldn't have been more excited for it to come on that way.
Through black radio.
Yeah, that was thrilling. And then it crossed over into the top 40 and became a big hit. And it's, of course, kicked the album into, I think the album was in the charts for 3 years. And but of course I was in that pattern. You make a record, you go on the road. You make a record, you go on the road. And I'd been at that for a good solid 5 or 6 years at that point. And so I had a good band. For the first time in my career up to that point, I had a manager at the insistence of my record company. It turned out to be one of the greatest, a legendary manager, Irving Azoff, who just changed my life in that professional way entirely. I was just a musician and with a hit record, and everything got better. Everything was suddenly took a quantum leap in terms of the travel, the musical instruments, everything kicked up, and I was in high gear at that point. But I was ready for it. It wasn't it was a long time coming in my mind. So the opportunities opened up, the gigs and the venues and so on and so forth. And we just hit the road hard.
Do you think if you had had a manager sooner, especially a manager like that, like Irving, that it would have had some other influence on your career?
That's an interesting question. I don't know, but I can't help but think it would have. After I saw how valuable that was, what a giant help that was. I can't help but think it would have.
So as you say, after your 10, 11 years of really working and then that massive success, you kind of retired for a little while in 1980. You went off the road. You didn't put out a record for a long time. What was happening for you during that time?
Well, I was sort of dealing with the home front at that time. I had two sons born. in the late 70s. And my home life was going through big changes. I'm pretty much full-time on the road, and the dynamics of my family changed. I went through a divorce in 1980, and then there was a lot of legal wrangling that went on, and just personal stuff. I think that also took a while to slow down, but when I did slow down, when I did stay off the road, I mean, I had planned on taking some time off to deal with my home affairs. But, you know, when you stop that quickly from the pace that you're on, you know, you just have a chance to look around. Just kind of like what I was talking about earlier when I was reminiscing as an older man about who I am after I give myself a chance to really cool off for a little while. I just started tending to other aspects of my life. I started hanging out with my friends in San Francisco and did some traveling. And of course, I was father of two young children and had my responsibilities as a father, which were the top of my responsibilities. So I did that for the next 6 or 7 years. It took a while to adjust, certainly, but I lived pretty close to the home front and did other things. Just did guy things. I played golf and traveled and went fishing and did other things. Then I drifted back into music.
One thing that you ultimately did was open a music venue in San Francisco.
That's right.
And it's incredible to think that until this pandemic, it was surviving. It had gone through ups and downs and all kinds of stuff, but it closed in the last year.
That's right, yeah. Oh, we had actually decided to close it before COVID. So we're in 2020 when COVID started. We decided at the end of 2019, about 4 months before COVID hit, to close the club. We had two clubs, actually, in San Francisco, Slim's and the Great American Music Hall. And the rents in the area where Slim's is, it was in the heart of the tech boom area of San Francisco, where Slim's was. And the rents were just skyrocketing, and we couldn't keep up. We had the two clubs. One was slightly larger and was very, very popular. And there was sustaining Slim's. So we just couldn't keep them both up, and it decided to sell Slim's. And COVID hit, and that sort of nailed it down. We had not found a buyer yet for it, but it was forced to close with the pandemic.
I have often thought that the only people who are crazier than those who want to be professional musicians are those who want to put on professional music shows.
You're absolutely right. We didn't make a dime on Slim's. Of all the hundreds of thousands, millions of people who went through there, the hundreds and thousands of bands that played there, it just sort of had its way. Fortunately, the partners that I had and that I accumulated over time as I needed more cash to sustain it were in it for the same thing that I was in it for. They loved the music, and they didn't really worry about the bottom line as long as they weren't. Somehow we were afloat, and the club was going on, and this beast was being served, and San Francisco was getting the music. So it went on probably longer than it should have, but it went on successfully to the end, successful in terms of providing the music.
Well, and it seems like it was yet another way for you to be connected to San Francisco. You know, it does sort of seem like one of the great love affairs of your life has been with San Francisco.
Yeah, well put. Thank you. You know, it's true. It did connect me. It supported me coming up, and I felt in my own small way I was giving something back to the city, and it kept me close to the street a lot of that time as well. I'll say in all fairness and in truth, I was involved very much the first few years of Slim's. We had a remarkable booking agent who loved this music that we presented, which was primarily blues, rhythm and blues, and jazz when we opened for the formative years of Slim's. I had a really wonderful time. I lived and breathed a lot into that club. And after that, it became a much more broad-based music. And I never had anything to do with the management or business part of the club for the next 25 years.
That's pretty
I
good.
wasn't so involved. Pretty good.
In more recent times, since you've been back on the road and back in that cycle of recording and touring a record, it seems like you've gotten into exploring the kinds of styles and musical genres, terrains that turned you on originally. You get to play in the sandbox of your choosing and go where you want to go, work with who you want to work with. And there's one record in particular that I just love and I want to ask you about. It's your album Memphis. I think it's the first one that you did with Steve Jordan producing. I'd love to hear the story of how that record came to be. It's not your most recent record, but it is the first in a series of your 3 most recent records, and they all seem to kind of hang together from a sense of the blues and the roots music.
Yeah, well, that one was really another one of those itches that had to be scratched. I made an album in the year 2000, which took me into the realm of some players that I hadn't worked with before. And in the course of making that record, I met Steve Jordan, the great percussionist and producer out of New York. And Steve and I just had we really seemed to click. And we sort of promised ourselves that we might look for an opportunity in the coming years to do something together. And we were, sort of in and out of touch over those years. And I got a recording contract and was sort of looking for a way forward. And I talked to Steve about it, and he was up for doing the project. So that was just another. I mean, it took all of about 5 minutes on the phone for us to figure out who we wanted to play on the record and where we were going to record it. It was just a pure joy going to Memphis with Steve and the players and choosing the material and putting that together.
It's just an incredible sounding record. I mean, the last 3 have just been fantastic.
Oh, man, thank you.
Oh, man, thank you. I can remember going home to visit my folks, and my dad played me that record for the first time. That's the first time I heard it was in my dad's car, and he was just saying, check out the sound of this record and check out the feeling and the atmosphere. And I know that we kind of went to school on it, and it informed some of the choices that we made in the music that we've recorded together, my father and I, in the last handful of years. I mean, it was not only something that we enjoyed listening to, but it was something that we kind of studied, and it influenced us.
Oh, wow. I'm flattered. Ben and I certainly have a lot in common in our musical. Well, he turned me on to a lot of stuff, too. He played me my first Horace Silver records because he knew that I was going to connect with Horace Silver. And sure enough, that he opened a lot of doors for me at a time in my life. I was all ears, and Ben was there with the songbook.
I'm glad that you bring that up, Boz. I would love to hear your memories of being in Madison in the 60s. I've heard so many stories from my parents about that time. I'd love to hear your version of it and what you took with you from it.
I came to Madison in 1962. It was such a great scene because Wisconsin. I came in the summer before school. The semester of school started in '62. I came up to get together with Steve. He and I had been pals in high school. He's a year older than I was, and came to Madison before me. And I went up after hearing the stories of what a great scene it was in Madison. I came up in the summer to just check it out and loved it. Madison, of course, in the summertime is paradise with the lakes and all the people there for summer school and the parties and the music and it was just heaven on earth to me. I had never been out. I'm from small town Texas, and I went to Dallas for my last 3 years of high school, and had a much more cosmopolitan sort of existence after I moved. I still lived in the little cattle town, but attended school in Dallas, and my horizons had expanded, but I'd never really been beyond Texas. So coming to Madison and being exposed to the people from all over, it was such an eye-opening experience. It was just such a blast of culture and new ideas and an exciting place to be. Then, of course, when the school term started, then everybody rolled in, all the wacky, just the parade of people that came in through Madison was phenomenal to me. I was in heaven. It was a paradise for me. I gave up thoughts of school very early on in that game and just had the time of my life. And made a lot of friends and did a lot of things. And it was heaven for 2 semesters. And I squeaked through the first semester. The second semester was just a given. There was no way I was going to finish that. But so I really got to like a lot of Madison and not much school, and had a great experience there. I left Madison after those 2 semesters. I flunked out.
Really?
Technically. Oh yeah, I got 2 Fs, and I was out of Madison. And it was when Vietnam was really heating up, and the draft was hanging over all of our heads. And if you flunked out of school, your draft lottery number went way up, and you're at the front of the list. That's another story. But I did return. I left Madison for about a year, and I returned the following summer and spent another full summer in Madison and continued my time there. Went back into school and just loved being there. Through all my travels, through all the experiences I've had, I've met more people through my connection with Madison than any other single thing I've done. I still meet people from all walks of life, and many of whom are doing very interesting things, who have lived all over the place, who have very interesting life experiences. Madison is a common denominator for so much that's happened in my life.
When you actually lay it out, it was a very short little time for you.
Yeah, it's very interesting for so much to happen and so much to hit me as it did. It was a rather short time.
Yeah, no kidding.
And to get to learn Chicago on holidays and weekends, to go to Chicago and see the clubs. And it was just such an opening for me.
As a Texas blues musician, as somebody who had started out in Texas and then to be so close to Chicago and see the way they were playing the music in Chicago, was it a different concept? Did it seem related?
Oh, most of what we were doing in Texas came out of Chicago. Texas definitely had its own style. There was a style of music that came out of Houston, the southern part of Texas, that was big band. It was sophisticated, like Bobby Bland. It was slick horn arrangements, and a lot of vocal stylists came out of there. And of course, New Orleans was just across the way, and we got New Orleans radio in Texas. And Texas had a lot of guitar players. Were king in Texas. But New Orleans was the home of the blues, but Chicago was where so much happened. So that was just like going to Mecca to go to Chicago. And the clubs were still full of the great masters. We saw, Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf and Little Walter, and we saw the greats. They were there. That was the most access to the greatest.
But then, so when you left Madison, that's when you went back to Texas? That's when you went to Austin?
Yeah.
And how'd you avoid the draft?
I didn't. I had to join the Army. I got a 6-month reserve program where you do 6 months of active duty, and then you're supposed to do 5.5 years of serving the reserves. So I had to either get drafted. I was very much opposed to the war, but I couldn't avoid the draft without doing something. You had to do something really. Yeah. Well, anyway, I joined the 6 month. I went to 6 months of active duty, and then I stayed on in Texas for a few months. There's a grace period after you've come out of that 6 months of active duty before you join the reserve units to which you attend. But I ended up leaving the country with some musician friends that I'd met in Austin. And we wanted to go to London. We were sort of fascinated by what we were hearing coming out of there and wanted to travel. So there were no provisions for being in the Army Reserve when you left the country. I wasn't dodging the Army. They had no provisions. I wanted to travel, so I did. I had to confront that issue when I came back to San Francisco several years later. But anyway, that was, I did not avoid the draft.
It's a very personal story for people. I know my dad tells the story of how he got this letter written by a doctor who I think actually was maybe in Milwaukee or something, but it was a doctor that he found through the Grateful Dead. The guys turned him on to the doctor that could write the letter that basically helped young men get out of the draft. He was a psychiatrist or a psychologist, something. He wrote a letter saying that these young men had some disorder that would prevent them from being drafted. And apparently all these musicians got these letters from this doctor.
Wow. I didn't know that doctor. I would have gone to. I did have my own lucky start later when I came back into America and the Army was looking for me. I had a lawyer. There were a number of lawyers in the Bay Area at that time who were helping young men with the draft status and with problems that they were having with the military. And I got some help at that time too. At that time when your dad and I were there, nobody, Madison was a major liberal institution, of course, and everybody was vulnerable. And the stories I'm sure you've heard about what it was like to go down to the draft board in Milwaukee or in Chicago were insane, what people would do.
Yes.
It was a freak show.
Freak show, exactly right.
Yeah.
It's hard to fathom. In fact, I always felt like I missed something. I grew up hearing all these stories about the 60s and what it was like, the confluence of culture and politics and urgency and fear and possibility. And I felt for a long time in my life that I belonged to kind of the lost generation. A generation that was sandwiched in between other generations. We didn't live through the 60s. We are a precursor to the technological revolution that happened in our lifetime. Like these younger kids today, they're growing up in a completely different way. But interestingly, COVID has put me in touch, I think, for the first time with a sense of this is what it feels like to live through something,
Yes.
And to know that the world is not going to be the same when it's over.
Wow. Interesting. That's really an interesting observation. My son, I've had the same reflections with my son, who's very close to your age.
Yeah.
And I think of you, too, as, having access to a real important part of that age and having handled it, really well. Of course, music is a common denominator. I related very much to Ben and Judy's having you and my having a son at about the same time. I've never heard that stated. I think my son would probably agree with what you've said to a great extent. You both were I have to think profoundly influenced by. We were close.
Yeah.
You were close. You were close to Ben. You very close.
Yes.
I was very close to my son, and I think you lived through some of that, a good deal of that with us.
Yes. Oh, yeah. And in terms of Austin, I have never talked to him about it, but just that familiarity and that understanding of what you guys went through and what the mentality of that generation was and what the values were, and all of that set him on his path, and in the same way that it has set me on my path. But yeah, for the first time, I feel this real presence of life around me, even though, as you said at the beginning, it's hard to want to look for silver linings in a pandemic, but they are there.
Yes, they are. I think there's a great deal happening right now. A tremendous sea change happening now.
Have you been able to write a song in the last 12 months?
No, I've asked myself many times, why am I not doing anything? I'm playing more guitar and singing than I have in years. It's a great comfort to me, as it always has been, as it is to so many of us. But no writing. I really, the only way that I can rationalize it or see it is that I always have to go through a sort of a settling routine before I write. Before I start. I'm a project guy. I don't have a notebook that I'm constantly writing in. I put myself to a task each time I have an album to do or a project to do. And in order to get into that, everything has to be settled around me. I create the conditions where there's no place else I can go. I back myself into a corner. It's systematic. I have to get everything in the world settled and out of my realm of thought, or it will distract me, and I will go do something else. Once I've finally got myself into a corner and can't get out, then I start writing with a gun to my head, and I can't get anything settled. Yeah. Because the first thing you do in the morning is, pick up your iPad or something and read the paper.
Yep.
And it's, I can't settle into anything. I'm reading now. I'm going in, I'm sure we're all going through our little phases, and I'm just I'm falling in love with books again. And I'm really digging in and enjoying it.
What are you reading?
I've got 3 books out now. I've got that Harari book, 21 Lessons for the 21st Century.
Yes.
And I have a Michael Pollan book called How to Change Your Mind, which I'm rereading, actually. And then I bought a thriller.
Well, man, it's going to sound pandering, but I have that Michael Pollan book next to the bed and Sapiens next to the bed also.
Yeah, really? Yeah, man. Sapiens is the most important book I've read in the last 5 years.
Yeah.
I mean, what a mind blower. And Michael Pollan.
Yeah, also.
What a mind blower.
Talk about a mind blower. Yeah, exactly.
Talk about a mind blower.
Well, Boz, listen, we could talk for hours, but I appreciate the 90 minutes that we've...
The same here. Most enjoyable.
Dedicated to this already. Is there anything else we should say on the record before I turn the machine off?
No, thanks. We've covered a lot of ground. I don't know where I would go otherwise. I'm open to wherever you want to go, whenever, and we'll explore that when we get together. I'd love to see you. Yeah,
likewise, man. It seemed like there was a few years where every time I went somewhere, I found you. I saw you in Japan one time. I ran into you at a taco joint in Austin one time.
Amazing. Well, we'll be out there again. Okay, man.
Okay, man. Take care. It's great to talk.
All the best.
All right.
Likewise. You too.
All right.
Bye-bye.
There he was, my friends, the great Boz Scaggs. What a cat. I'll be back in your feeds to meet your needs and do the deep diving deeds again before you know it. Until then, I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you. Signs of a misspent youth. No? Can't beat it.